I think that I might be stretching it as the years go by, but I think we scored 17 fish in that first spring. And I made the very bad mistake of thinking that I had Lake Eildon wired. And that's probably the biggest mistake you can ever give yourself, and you're inviting a kick in the pants if you think that way. It can certainly be challenging. In the winters and springs that have followed since then, I've actually found the fishing a fair bit harder than that in terms of actual raw numbers. But we've adopted our techniques a bit to try and match the bait in that waterway. There's significant bait in Eildon, which is why you see them so well conditioned. It's why they're so well fat. And we're strongly of the opinion that these fish are really, really well fed, and they are spoilt for choice. We started to switch it up and use swim baits and different new age lures in an attempt to show them something different. They see a lot of spinner baits. They see a lot of crankbaits or divers or hard bodies, as we call them in Australia. And there's nothing wrong with those lures. They catch an enormous amount of fish. But we wanted to show them something different. And we've actually enjoyed amazing success, especially in 2019, by mixing it up and showing them some of these lures that actually come out of the US bass fishing scene, especially in Southern California, where they chase really, really big trophy bass. These fish see every lure known to man thrown across them every day, not just weekends, and they're incredibly fussy. And some of these new age baits have been getting really significantly good results. So before we get into the actual baits, I want to pose the question, are some fish easier to catch than others? I think you'll ask anyone with any depth of experience that bigger, older Murray cod are probably a little bit smarter. Rob alluded to it in his chat earlier. He spoke about them being the big, wise old fish. And I think for the most part, people would generally agree. But there's probably a number of other factors about Murray cod and the way we've got a slot limit now and we keep putting fish back and not removing them, that we're quite potentially actually making these fish smarter. There's also a view that there is genetic variations in fish where some are risk takers and some are programmed basically to be more cautious, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. I'll talk about it now. In exploring this thought that some fish are smarter than others or more risk averse or risk takers than others, I did a fair bit of research and found some interesting stuff on the net. And whilst this isn't Murray cod research, I think there's a degree that you can take some lessons from this across various species. There was a study done in the 70s in Illinois in the USA on a lake containing largemouth bass, and every fish that was caught in that lake was returned. I presume it was a private lake to be able to police that aspect of it. Every fish that was caught was given a tag with a number, and over the course of a 5-year study, they found that some fish were caught up to 15 times. That's a fairly risk-taking fish. There was another one that was caught 12 times and many other variances down to that. When they drained the lake, they found numerous fish that had never been caught. They split that categorisation of fish from those that had been caught 4 or more times into one pond, and they took those that had been caught 3 or less times into another pond, and they actually bred 3 generations of fish over a 14-year period. What they found at the end of that study was that the fish that were more easily caught, and they're calling them the risk takers, became easier and easier to catch. They were predisposed to strike at shiny things, to chase things down. They were really active fish. They used a lot of energy in how they went about things. The cautious fish, they found they actually made them harder and harder to catch. And they've got to eat right, but they're very picky and selective about how they go about what they eat. They weren't so more into bright and shiny things. They could be caught on baits, essentially live baits, which I found a really interesting study when we look at our lures that we throw at Murray cod. Without a doubt, take away those kind of genetic aspects of fish, whether they're wired to be a risk taker or they're wired perhaps to be a little bit more cautious. I think for sure there's things that we're doing in our practices, and they're great practices, that are probably educating our fish to an extent. Catch and release. You'd imagine a fish that's been caught on a particular type of lure, released to fight another day and get bigger, and perhaps maybe it happens again. Over time, he might get a little bit more educated and a little bit smarter about those bright and shiny things, or those things that vibrate really, really hard. The risk-taking fish quite often might get, well, not quite often, but they might get removed from the gene pool, leaving behind those cautious fish that are less inclined to bite. Fishing pressure undoubtedly has an effect on the fish's desire to strike at a lure. We know that waterways can actually significantly shut down in times of high boat activity, high angler pressure and activity. Doesn't mean to say that it won't return back to a relatively normal state a period of time after, but we can really shut these fish down for a period. But at the end of the day, they do have to eat at some point. And in the case of some of our big Murray cod, like that 103 centimetre fish from Eildon, he's clearly eating a lot. So how can we catch him? So I'll move on to the discussion about new age baits. No, I'm not talking about those kind of baits, live bait, or I don't know how we categorise cheese. It's not a dead bait, I don't know, artificial bait, whatever it is, although cheese is real. They're not the baits that I'm talking about. I'm talking about these kind of baits. It's essentially a very US based term that we've adopted for a lot of our lures here. A spinnerbait, a soft swim bait, a glide bait, a crankbait, a hard swim bait, or a wake bait. They're terms that we're actually using day in, day out in our fishing and in our tackle industry, and that's what I mean by new age baits. I think for the most part, when we think of Murray cod fishing, we're probably Murray cod lure casting, we're talking about spinner baits and crankbaits for the most part. But there's new players on the scene, and they're catching a lot of really good fish. So just before I move on to the types of baits, I'll just draw this to your attention. I've made up a word there, impressionism. I don't think it exists in the dictionary, but I do it as the opposite of realism. A lot of these new age baits really look like fish. They swim incredibly lifelike. They look lifelike in the hand and in the water, and I can't help it but think myself that the fish are seeing them in that way, that they are real. Conversely, in the impressionism side of it, say a big flashy 4-blade spinnerbait with a big trailer, it actually, I'll go out on a limb and say it doesn't look like a fish. But in murky water perhaps, that flashing little bit of colour that's put out, the thump of the blade, it might be enough for a fish to think, oh, that could be a fish. Or it might be a group of fleeing bait fish, but it's an impression, isn't it? It's not a real accurate representation of a fish. And I think in clear water, that's really, really relevant. So we're talking about, with these new age baits, significant realism in looks. That's a roach and a bait clearly designed to look a hell of a lot like a roach. Realism in swim. Really accurate, enticing swimming actions that the baits that will glide and hang. Not all bait fish swim away hard. They're not all thumping, putting out massive amounts of vibration. I'd go out on a limb to say that a lot of baits get hit stationary in an ambush mode. And that's very hard to represent with a lot of the lures we use, is to make them actually stationary so a cod can engulf it. And in clear water, that realism in swim is really important. In fact, I'll say myself, I regard the swim of a lure, the accuracy with which it looks like a fish's swim, is more important to me than coloration or that accurate look, but that's just my view. So we've been fishing these new age baits pretty hard for not just in Eildon, a lot of other waterways, from Mulwala, which is a bit of a dirtier water, kind of you got that mid-clarity that you get often in Mulwala, or even clearer impoundments like Blowering or Copeton Dam up in northern New South Wales, but mostly at home in Eildon, where we've enjoyed some really, really good success fishing these type of lures almost exclusively now, trying to represent actual bait fish as accurately as possible. And we've done pretty well with them. Not to say we wouldn't have done well fishing other types of lures, but it's the path we've gone down, and it's I'd say we've enjoyed our best winter yet on Lake Eildon this year, not just in terms of turning over some good numbers of fish, but our average size went right up. I think, I don't know what our actual average was, but I don't think we caught anything less than 80 centimetres, and we got a couple of fish in our little network of guys just over the metre, and lots of 90s. As a side point, how absolutely good is Eildon and the trophy fishery that it's actually become. I used to talk about Eildon's potential. Forget potential, it's here now. So moving on to a couple of the actual baits, and just to, I guess, basically familiarise yourself with them if you're not used to these new style of lures, what they are and what they're designed to do. And for the most part, I think wake baits are probably the easiest. They vary from lures that will work right along the surface and essentially have a slow swim or very slight paddle about them on the surface of the lure, basically to represent a land animal on the surface of the water. And there's other wake baits that actually do go subsurface. They're all definable by having a very sharply angled bib. Not a bib that faces forward like you might get on a crankbait that makes it actually vibrate really hard and dive down. They have quite a sharply angled downward bib, more designed around making the lure swim than making it go deep. You can add chin weights, etc. to them to make them go subsurface. But they're relatively easy lures to use. I find they actually bump over snags pretty well. I actually use wake baits in the Murray and find that, well, to touch wood, don't lose too many. Got a short video here of the swim action. Hopefully this works. So you get a fair old S-shape out of these at a pretty slow speed. They put out probably a moderate thump, but we've enjoyed really, really good success on these. Next up is soft swim baits, and I think in your goodie bags today you've got a soft swim bait from Xeric in there. Enjoy that, and it might get you into a bit of this style of fishing potentially. Certainly give it a go. This is a bait that we've actually probably enjoyed the most success from. They're in the terms of these new age baits, they're the cheapest. They're essentially a big soft plastic. They rely generally on a large paddle tail to get the lure to create a thumping action through the tail. We use these really, really slowly in Eildon in clear water. We don't really look for the big thump that you're going to see probably in the video. Those videos, for mine, the lure's actually moving a little bit too fast. We like to fish these really slow, quite deep, and hang these in the fish's face. And the number of good bites that we're getting on these in lakes in probably the 4 to 8 metre range is I'll stand behind them any day. So lures like that, essentially they look quite accurately like a fish shape, and that boot tail creates most of the kick. Usually you get a little bit of head roll through the actual body as well. That's obviously on super slow-mo, that video there. That's sitting in current. Looks like a trout. Generally, the soft swim baits are probably a little bit, as a rule, a little bit more elongated, a little bit more trout-like in their shape, but there are others that have got a deeper body that embody the look of a roach or a redfin perhaps a bit better. Very easy to fish, slow roll for the most part, and a pause for effect is a very good time to get bit. Hard swim baits. Kind of what I'll say here is what is a hard swim bait first and foremost. And what I'll call them is multi-sectioned hard lures. Usually there's 3 sections to the body, sometimes more. Sometimes you see 5 or 6 sections to a hard swim bait. You'll see one there that's only got 2 sections. There's a difference between a swim bait and a glide bait in terms of the balance. And I don't want to confuse you, but the smaller section on that one that's in the bottom left is what makes it not a glide bait. And I'll talk about why when I move over to the glide bait slide. But these fish have been scoring really good Murray cod for many years, way beyond the 5 years or so. The top left there, the jackal is, it's pretty famous, but there's some newcomers that are just as hot and causing quite a ruckus. A little bit of skill level required to use these to get the best out of them. Generally, as the angler, you feel you're winding in these swim baits super slow, and you get a bit of a feeling of, I don't think it's doing anything, I don't think it's doing enough. And the lure's really not moving much through the water, but it's incredibly natural. I think we're just used to feeling the feedback of a diver or of a spinnerbait, and we take comfort in feeling that thump, 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 and we think mentally, we're putting out enough noise and enough racket to lure a fish in. These lures kind of go the opposite way of that, of forget the feedback that we get as the angler, but the fish is getting something incredibly natural gliding in front of it and not getting that thump, thump, thump. It is essentially a lot more of a natural presentation, which we'll take a bit of a look at here. A lot of these lures are actually moving way too fast for what I consider how a swim bait should be presented, but you get the idea from it. A lot of these lures are probably a little bit more snag prone than what you're used to with a crankbait or a spinnerbait. But when used carefully, I think the first thing you do when you start swim baiting is you go and buy yourself a couple of good lure retriever systems, and we get most of them back. And the final type I want to talk about briefly is glide baits, and I actually believe that these have got the most potential. The video I'll show you of them in a moment, they have as the name suggests, they glide out to the side and pause before being glided back. They really hang in the face of the fish. That's a mulwhaler fish. It's a really subtle lure, but it's still getting bit in relatively dirty water. Bit of skill level required for a glide bait. If you were foraying into these new style of lures, it wouldn't be the first place I'd go to. I'd suggest your soft swim baits probably and your wake baits as your first port of call. But once you get competent, I think these are the absolute answer. And we're seeing US bass anglers actually come over here and do quite well with these on our own doorstep with Murray cod. That difference between the hard swim baits that I showed you before and these glide baits will be a 2-segment lure, and they will be very equally balanced in their weight from one piece to the other piece. Super finely balanced lures, to the point where if you upgrade your split rings or your hooks, there's a significant chance you'll throw that lure out and it won't swim as well as it should. You've got to literally weigh your hooks on in grams or points of a gram to get it right if you're going to upgrade to keep the same balance of how these things actually swim. And have a look at the various retrieves that you can get out of them. They're most dangerous on their paws, when they've gone out to one side and they hang out there. You notice from the line that you can see the belly in the line, it's not even being fished on a relatively tight line. It's almost like there's a bit of slack in it. So that's where we hope to graduate to a little bit with our fishing with new age baits, is to being really competent with the glide baits, which they're a little bit trickier to use, but I think they'll be deadly when we get our use of them spot on. By no means am I saying, and I'll reiterate kind of what I led off with, that the other methods, the other lure types have had their day and don't work, not for a million years. A good friend of mine, Cam McGregor, is a Murray cod guide, and he's always talking to me about what's new on the market, what's different out there, because the waters that he fishes are heavily pressured, and he likes to show them something new, put something new in front of their face. His view in the clear waters that he fishes is that these fish have seen every lure, they probably know it by brand, and they're looking for something that looks real and potentially haven't seen before. So give it some thought. Now I'm going to show you a little video of just a little bit of the action that we've had using wake baits and swim baits in a couple of different waterways, mostly Eld, and I think there's a little bit of the Murray in there. It's short, and it just gives you a bit of a feel for the excitement you can get fishing these types of lures. Now there is a language warning, and there is a naughty word. And I've got Taylor Hunt on the dump button. There you go, I've passed responsibility. And let's hope this doesn't come through. Was that a fair warning? All right. All right, we're past the naughty word. Yep. Definitely second rate. Oh, good one. Oh, fish on. That needs to be. Fish on. Ah, string. Go on. Yep. Fish on. Beautiful. As you can see, Andy Smith nearly needed a new set of dentures there. But it's exciting stuff. It's really good fun, and I think personally, for the way I fish in the clear water impoundments that we fish, it makes an actual difference. I'm quite convinced of that. You don't have to do it, but I reckon it's well worth a go. Thank you.